So one of the key questions that is puzzling to look at language is also just the language of other animals, essentially other species. And so I think without a doubt there is a nonverbal language in some respects, but the language of other species certainly is not in any way akin to what we have as humans. And clearly, I think everyone would agree that animals do communicate. And what has happened over the years, as you see in this picture, is we've taught primates to communicate through sign language. And like I mentioned before, they still have a ceiling as to what they actually can understand. And some would say maybe a 2-year-old would be the tops in terms of vocabulary that many of the apes develop. Some might say a first grader, which would be more in the range of what we might say 6-year-olds. But the vocabulary still has a ceiling to it, and essentially when you look at the ape brain versus the I'm going to put a ceiling to learning as evidenced by AEB is a psych term, as evidenced by vocabulary. When you look at an ape brain and you look at a human brain, what you'll find is a vastly larger associative area in our brain compared to apes. But they have learned sign language. They have developed considerable vocabularies for them, not compared to humans. And ultimately, there is still that ceiling that occurs. So they don't. One of the key elements is syntax. The rules of grammar even are hard for them to learn. So they essentially make up their own words because they don't know the syntax that we learn relatively early on, even without direct instruction itself. So clearly, when we talk about language, we're talking about a contextualized language of gestures and various sounds, but it doesn't reach the level, that's an E there, it doesn't reach the level of the kind of language and richness that we can communicate by the development of our language itself. So the ape vocabularies generally are fairly simple, more similar, like I mentioned, to a 2-year-old. They can make signs and push buttons in sequence to get a reward. What's interesting is that they will display a perceptual set much like we do and get caught into a perseverative problem-solving routine that they find it difficult to get out of. And like I said, with perceptual set, we tend to see what we want to see, and that's also true. Of course, there is a ceiling to what their problem-solving techniques are that we oftentimes see. So a variety of animals can pick up language. I mean, the example in your book of the border collie who has up to 200 human word vocabulary, but most of that has been built on behaviorism and behavioral techniques that chain the meaning of a word with usually a reinforcer of some sort, and that's usually true of the more lead to a receptive language in other species. And that's generally true of most animals, that the more intelligent of the dogs can read signs, not signs like road signs, but signs like a red light versus a green light and so forth. Seeing eye dogs have an incredible capacity to exercise a fair amount of reasoning, if we want to use that term. So just a couple other things in terms of other species that's important to understand when it comes to language development itself. Another important topic, at least in language development, is the connection between thinking and language and how they interact with one another. And one of the key figures in this debate is a guy by the name of Benjamin Whorf. And I'll just put his name up here, his last name. And the concept that he came up with is something that he referred to as linguistic determinism. And it's an important concept in understanding the cultural components of language itself. And we all think about things for which we really have no words. But what Whorf was suggesting is that our language itself shapes people's basic ideas. And an example would be the picture of these kids in Papua New Guinea, and how essentially the things that are important in that culture have a greater degree of words attached to it, or language. Important concepts lead to language subtleties. And essentially, that we see that in a variety of contexts, whether it's in Papua New Guinea or whether it's the Inuits in Alaska, who have 18 different words to describe snow, because it is subtleties. Because it's an important aspect of their existence and their everyday livelihood, essentially. And in a lot of cases, people would suggest that his notion is way too extreme. We have a lot of things that we think about that we may not have a word for. You know, can you think of a shade of blue that you cannot name, for example? And so it's not as deterministic as Whorf would have us to believe. In other words, his notion is that the language shapes the person's basic ideas, and so if we don't have a word for it, the idea doesn't exist, essentially, and that's the idea of linguistic determinism. So our words may not determine what we think, but they certainly do influence how we think about things, or what our thinking actually is. So determinism is not the case, but certainly determinism is not the same as influencing. And so it's not as lockstep as Whorf would have us believe, but certainly influencing has a great deal to do with it. We use language to form categories, and that would be a good example. Classifying colors would be another example of the words we actually use. Interestingly enough, you can see people in different professions actually have a language which we would not normally have in terms of, like, color, for example. And so the idea that language determines thought is more accurate, actually, for us to say that language influences thought. It expresses our thoughts. It's at the service of our thoughts rather than actually framing it altogether. So needless to say, we can think not only in words, but we can also think in images as well. And then we go about trying to describe it, which is part of the mental picture that we have about it. And that one of the words that we use for this is non-declarative. I didn't get my C in there. Declarative memory or knowledge. It's not contained in the words, but it is contained in the mental image we have. And we may be able to produce the image, but not necessarily have the words necessary to actually describe it itself. So those are all key to understanding. The last thing I want to comment on is really the interplay of thoughts and language. And really the bottom line is, in terms of what we've been talking about with Worf and linguistic determinism, is that what one determines, the other determines as well. So you have a reciprocality between thinking and language, which really looks a little bit like a circle, where you have thinking up here in terms of thoughts and so forth, and you have language down here, and they both influence each other. And so essentially, where one influences language, then language influences thought, and vice versa all the way through. And then we refer to that as a mutually reciprocal system. And I think that's describing really the basics of thought and language and so forth. But it's important to understand that we are not determined only by our language. We're influenced by our language, and that influences then our thinking. If I don't have a vocabulary for something, then I might find it very difficult to describe it. The same thing is true for thinking, is that if I don't have a mental image of it, then how do I think about it? And all of those are key points in understanding the nature of thought and language.